we're going to break the habit of a lifetime and start a couple of minutes early because one of our guests has to leave. But we are here basically to discuss Paul Collier's excellent book, The Future of Capitalism. He will be speaking about it a bit later. But we also have a surprise guest, Liz Truss, who is, of course, hard cop to Philip Hammond's soft cop at the Treasury. And she is going to give us some general thoughts about the economy, economic reform, and then ask Paul a couple of leading questions. Paul will then speak for, what have you prepared, Paul, for sort of 10 minutes or so? 10, 12 minutes. We then have Paul Ormerod, who is a political economist, owner of the Rochdale Hornets Rugby League Club, and author of a recent collection of his shorter works from City AM called Against the Grain. And to Paul's left is John Chronus, the Labour MP for Dagenham and Rainham, and one of the most creative thinkers on the blue Labourish side of the Labour Party in recent years. Warwick, you're not joining us. You're not joining us up here anyway. You're going to contribute from the floor. Is that correct?
No, I'm going to.
Oh, you. Oh, okay. Right. Well, there is a spare seat there for you now, if you'd like to sit there.
I'm not sure if I'd advocate Warwick
All right.
representing me.
Okay. Anyway, so over to Liz, who will speak, and then has to ask Paul a question, and then leave before she can hear the answer.
I'll get a recording.
So, would you want to stand here? Or? Yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Well, I think it's great that Policy Exchange are hosting this event this evening. I think this is one of the great questions of our age. And what I feel as somebody who is a great supporter of free enterprise and the free market is, the nature of the questions we're asking ourselves about how it operates. And why now? Why are we asking ourselves the question? And I think the answer is 10 years after the financial crash, we've seen wages not rising as fast as they have done. We've seen growth across the Western world, not what it was. And people's expectations have not been fulfilled in many respects. And I feel that those of us who are on the free enterprise side of the debate perhaps didn't successfully make the arguments early on in the aftermath of the financial crash. Often it was the bankers who were blamed, and there was certainly fault on that side. But also it was the regulators, so whether in the US it was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, or here in the UK, the tripart regulatory system. And a lot of people had a lot of interest during the noughties in stoking the debt bubble and leaving us in the situation we were. So we've got to this point now where there is questioning of free market solutions, but the alternatives that are being proposed are pretty dramatic and have never succeeded anywhere in the world. And what we have to do, I believe, is start making the argument from first principles. So what are we fundamentally talking about here? We're talking about whether economic decisions should be made by the individual and their families and by firms, or whether they should be made by the government, whether or not we should nationalise industries that are currently in private hands, or whether those industries should remain in private hands and give people control of their own lives. And one of the things I observe is that, contrary to the claims that the next generation are a bunch of socialists heading for communes, in fact, if you look at opinion polling, you see that people under the age of 30 are more in favour of lower taxation. They're more likely to want to own their own business. They're more likely to want control of their own lives. But the frustrations come from the barriers in their way to be able to do that. And what we need to do is start addressing some of those barriers. So, for example, what about competition in utilities? I'm a big supporter of privatisation, creating new utilities in areas like electricity, gas and broadband. But the fact is that other countries like Korea now have competition between those utilities. It's easier for new entrants to go into those markets. If you look at the banking sector, we've got challenger banks here like Starling and Metro Bank. But how easy is it for them to compete against some of the big players in the market? And quite often, larger players in the market will try and erect barriers for those new entrants to come through. Now, the biggest place where people erect barriers in the market is in housing. And it is the case that NIMBYs often, whilst wanting to have a house themselves, also want to look out on an empty field rather than see new houses built near them. And I think that's the classic case of incumbents not really liking new entrants in a market. So where I very much agree with the author of The Future of Capitalism and is on our mutual dislike of the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act and the way that it has prevented people being able to realise their dreams. And we've seen for years more houses being built in France and Germany than in Britain. And in my view, if we don't remove some of those barriers, it's going to be very hard for the next generation to afford to get on the property ladder, but even afford to rent in London. The average person is paying 50% of their income in rent. So yes, we have problems, but I think we've got to be careful not to blame all those problems on free enterprise. Many of those problems are about mobility, and we've seen people moving for work fall by 25% in the last 15 years. That's actively stopping people coming from different parts of the country to where there might be jobs available. I moved from Leeds to London in the 1990s. I didn't have any family here. I was able to afford to rent. Would somebody now moving from Leeds or indeed to other parts of the country where new jobs becoming available be able to do that? So we need to tackle these issues. But what I think is very important is that as believers in the free market, we don't try and trash the brand of capitalism and say that capitalism isn't working. Yes, there are things about our system that aren't working. I've mentioned the planning system. There are other areas I would like to look at, like utilities, regulation. Chris Grayling has started a consultation on rail. I think there are great things to admire about Japan and the fact they have integrated track and train. But these are public policy issues. They're not issues about capitalism, and I think sometimes we get those two things confused. Now, I haven't fully read the book yet, but I'm looking forward to some great bedtime reading this week on the future of capitalism. But I did read one part of the book which said that 1945 to 1970 was the greatest period for British capitalism. And although I'm an admirer of many things the government did at that time, it wouldn't strike me that was in fact the case. I think that's a period where Britain failed to gain competitive advantage over other countries, where we essentially lost some of our industrial strength, where our management lagged behind those of our international competitors, and where we failed to capitalise on the opportunities we had. I think also in areas like education, Britain was overtaken by many of our competitors. So my question this evening to kick the debate off is really, given the state that Britain ended up in the mid-1970s, where we had to go to the IMF cap in hand and where we had seen subsidised industries essentially fail, how can it be justified that 1945 to 1970 was the golden era? That's how I wanted to kick off.
Thank you very much, Liz. Well, thank you, Liz. And yeah, as I say, she's not going to stay for the answer. I should have said earlier, by the way, that Paul's book is for sale at the back of the room for a mere £20, is it, or is there some special discounted price? Well, we'll start at £20 anyway. Now, Paul, you might. I'm not sure if you want to add a brief riposte to what Liz said, but perhaps you can weave it into your words about your book as you go along. But Paul is going to talk for perhaps a bit more than 10 minutes, and then we have 3 gentlemen to respond. So over to you, Paul.
Well, it's very good of Liz Truss to come and open our event. It would have been even better if she'd read the book or stayed to hear the answers. But setting up saying free market capitalism is wonderful and what we need is more deregulation, and isn't that good because otherwise we've got communism, is exactly the problem that our society has plunged into. These awful extremes. Capitalism cannot be left on autopilot. We do need capitalism. It's the only system that the decentralized decision stuff is absolutely right. We need decentralized decisions. But capitalism, left to autopilot, periodically derails big time. In the last 200 years, it's derailed 3 times, very seriously. The first around the 1840s. This was Adam Smith's specialization, division of labor, come into cities and get factories and you become much more productive, and people did. They also died like flies. Life expectancy in the rural areas was about 33 for a laborer. In the cities, it was 19. These were killing fields because we didn't know how to do public policy of cities. So the market was delivering the nearest approximation to hell on earth that we've ever seen, I think, the 19th century northern cities where I grew up. And then the next derailment was obviously in the 1930s, sort of within not living memory, but the memory of our own society. And then the latest was just 10 years ago. But the 10 years ago blow up, it's fascinating that Liz Truss should just blame deregulation. I mean that is scandalous, right? What we should be blaming from the 1980s onwards is this mantra introduced by Friedman that the sole purpose of the firm is to make profits. That was a complete aberration, right? Until then, the ethic of a lot of businesses, they had a sense of purpose much larger than making profit. And that goes back to the 1840s. The 1840s was such hell that Titus Salt, an industrialist, mayor of Bradford, became a great philanthropist. He was mayor when cholera struck. Thousands of people were dying, his people. And so what did he do? He used his fortune to improve Bradford and build salt air, which then became the pioneer for the Cadburys, the Leverhumes. John Lewis is the latest expression of that. That is responsible business, right? And it's got a sense of purpose much beyond profit, right? That's on the healthy side of the right. It's not this Friedman stuff. And on the left, again, those 1840s produced exactly the same phenomenon. You're from Rochdale, aren't you, Paul?
Yes.
That was the birth in the 1840s, of course, of the what became a global movement, the cooperative movement. And what Titus Salt and the Rochdale pioneers, they were both pioneers forged by this same hellish experience of capitalism going seriously wrong. And both of them, the businessman and the Rochdale pioneers, what they had in common was they saw capitalism produce these massive new anxieties. Where are we going to live? In the 1840s, one of the big worries, if you were dying at 19, are we going to get a proper burial? And so the cooperative movement was built around reciprocal obligations to deal with very practical anxieties. It was a pragmatic movement, just as Salt's was a pragmatic movement. And what's happened, both on the left and the right, is that these pragmatic attempts to produce real solutions to real anxieties got hijacked by the ideologues, the free marketeers of the right, and on the left, you got the utilitarian economists who believed in the paternalist state, and you got the Rawlsian lawyers who believed in victim groups, privileged victim groups. And so on left and right, the pragmatists who were busy trying to meet ordinary anxieties disappeared at just the time they were most needed, because along came forces of globalization, greater complexity to push productivity up, and these forces produced rising productivity for the average, but not by any means equal well-being. Some globalization and rising complexity were, as Mervyn King says, it was the gift that keeps on giving. We get two big divergences in our societies starting in about 1980. A spatial divergence between a booming agglomeration, London, and periodically broken towns and cities, Stoke, Sheffield. Right? You all know what happened to Sheffield. It's just some of you don't know it was Sheffield. You'll all have seen the full Monty. That's Sheffield being broken. That was a 700-year-old steel agglomeration, mentioned in Chaucer, that was destroyed in 5 years of mismanagement by the likes of Mrs. Truss. Right? So that was the one split between the broken provinces and this booming agglomeration. And that was not unique to Britain. It's exactly the same spatial divide across Europe and North America. And then there was a new class divide. And the new class divide was not between the inherited wealth and those without it. It was between those with higher education and those with less education. Because the higher education people were benefiting from the rising complexity. You needed more skills, more cognitive skills. And so people like me were on the up escalator, rising value of our skills and knowledge. And then at the same time, globalization was destroying a lot of the non-cognitive skills, as in Sheffield. And those people who'd had the dignity of skill were on the down escalator, their skills were being devalued. So those are the two big splits that have ripped through our society, the spatial split and the new class divide. And meanwhile, nothing's been done about them. Nothing's been done about them because the ideologues have captured each party. And so they're not interested in addressing pragmatically the practical anxieties that have been generated by these processes. They're interested in their own agenda. That's why Liz Truss can stand there and say, what we need is more deregulation. I couldn't make it up. The consequence of these neglected anxieties was mutinies. The mutiny of Brexit, the mutiny of Trump. And whether you're pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit, fundamentally these are mutinies. Mutinies are not about we've got the solution. They're about the anger and frustration of anxieties that aren't being addressed. Quite often mutinies end rather badly. Mutiny on the Bounty ended up with the mutineers stuck on bloody Pitcairn, right? But their mutiny was triggered by unaddressed genuine concerns. So what can be done in my last minute, 2 minutes?
Yeah, fine, keep going.
I was very proud that, consistent with Liz Truss, I got savaged by the Lawsons in the Sunday Times on Sunday.
Only by one of them.
One
actually.
of them, yeah. Well, probably in defense of his dad. Meanwhile, I've got Nobel laureate George Akerlof, Nobel laureate in economics. I've got Mervyn King, I've got John Kay, and I've got that noted fascist Michael Sandel, the moral philosopher from Harvard. So I've got my supporters too. I gave you quite a good review as well. Yeah, and I've got allies nearer home. Yes, sorry about that. I'll give you three. Trying to most of the book is about solutions. That's what's distinctive about the book. It's not just a whine about what's gone wrong, it's how we can fix it. And there I'm using my economics, right? But I'll give you just three quick things. One is a move away from the social paternalism of the utilitarian saints who say, you know, we will look after you, which has produced a sort of rather authoritarian set of social policies, to what I call social maternalism. It's a phrase so new that Google won't accept it, right? And what is social maternalism? It's facing the reality that children need to be brought up in families. And children of young parents face all sorts of difficulties all the way along the line. There's a very good study by Robert Putnam, Our Kids. There's a very good news study, Richard Layard, Thrive, detailing practical ways in which children derail from birth right through to adulthood, and ways that you can reduce the risks of derailing by providing practical support. So that's social maternalism. Next is vocational training. Britain is at the extreme insane end of placing all our esteem on cognitive skills. Get a degree. And so too much of the population is esteem chasing, getting degrees that lead nowhere. Meanwhile, the more difficult transition, if you think about it, is the children who are not so cognitively gifted, but have to make a jump from cognitive training to non-cognitive acquisition of skills. And that we just neglect. We just leave them, you know, exemplified by the SNP cutting the budget for vocational training in order to do free cognitive education at the university. Right? I mean, that was the most regressive transfer you could imagine. Right? And it was just this esteem chasing. Middle-class parents want their kids to go and get a degree. Right? What's my model here? Well, it's what Liz Truss would recognize as an ultimate Marxist state, which is Switzerland. Because what Switzerland does, 60% of its youth don't take the cognitive route. Switzerland, like us, has got top 10 university. Right? So it does the cognitive stuff very, very well. But it does the non-cognitive stuff even better. 60% of Swiss youth go through that non-cognitive route. It's equally prestigious. Some of the guys who are running the Swiss banks went that route. And what is it? It's 4-year training. Half of the cost is financed by firms. And that means the firms make damn sure that the people who come out are employable. Yeah? So that's the vocational training. There is a model. We're not doing it. We're at the extreme end of not doing it. So social maternalism, vocational training, and then finally the broken cities. Contrasted with the booming agglomeration. Some of you will follow Janan Ganesh, and Janan Ganesh is the ultimate metropolitan, and he got this wonderful phrase of what it feels like to be a metropolitan viewing the rest of Britain. He says it feels like being shackled to a corpse. Great sense of social cohesion there, isn't there? You can hear the concern coming out, you know, dripping off his... let me tell Janan Ganesh and those of you from London what it feels like from the provinces. Right? And it feels like being shackled to a shark. Because a lot of the activities in London are actually zero-sum activities that are rent-seeking. And you get very high returns to those activities, but actually partly they're socially useless or socially excessive, asset management law and such like, and partly they're highly productive precisely because everybody's together in an agglomeration. And that agglomeration of London has been achieved by decades, actually centuries, of national effort. And so a lot of the returns, the exceptional, what economists call rents of agglomeration. And the rents of agglomeration should accrue to all of us. So the bankers and the lawyers think they actually earn it, but they don't. Right? That should be taxed and used to finance the recovery of broken cities. Now, what does it mean, the recovery of broken cities? It does not mean put them on benefit street. And that's the terrible failure of the utilitarian economists, thinking that everybody's just little economic man, only interested in consumption. Economic man likes to consume, doesn't like to work. Right? We know people like that. We call them slobs. Right? The reality is, of course, people get dignity from the work they do. And they're also not infinitely greedy. People are perfectly capable of taking obligations upon themselves. That was the essence of the cooperative movement, reciprocal obligations. And so what's happened as a result of both the far left and the far right is that people have been stripped of a sense of moral agency. The obligations have just all floated up to the state, and what's showered down from the state, very differentially, is rights. The genius of the cooperative movement of reciprocal obligations of Titus Salt was, because your obligations are reciprocal, the rights exactly match your obligations. Right? So we moved away from that. So how do we recover broken cities? It's a coordination problem. Here I'll finish. A coordination problem requires bringing knowledge-intensive firms together in a cluster. It's perfectly possible to do that. There are good role models of how to do it, both in East Asia and across the sea in Ireland. They pioneered all this of how to get new clusters going. We're just not doing it. Right? And as with social maternalism, as with vocational training, we've just dropped the ball. And what's happened is we're being run by ideologues who just think all we need is more market, less regulation. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. We will make sure that Liz Truss has a recording of that on her desk tomorrow morning. In the meantime, over to you, another Paul.
Well, thanks very much. I think the first thing I want to say is it is a very interesting book. It's very well argued, fascinating. I strongly urge you to buy a copy. Now, I'm saying that because I'm going to be rather critical of a number of points in the book in a different way from Liz Truss. So what are the key themes in the book? Well, one, obviously, which has come out already, is that Paul is from Sheffield. But not just that, he actually auditioned for a role in the Four Yorkshiremen sketch. I believe you just lost out to Michael Palin, Paul. So, and it's become clear that I'm from Rochdale, and in fact I grew up on a rough council estate. But I've got to correct David that Rochdale Hornets Rugby League Football Club is not. I'm not the owner, as is suited to town. It's a cooperative, and I'm merely the president. Now I'm mentioning these things because when we go out for dinner later, Paul and I are going to play a game of authenticity snap, and I think my card trumps his. But moving on to some more serious points, right? I think it's rather ironic that we're discussing this book the week after the Brookings report came out last week, showing how capitalism has actually transformed the lives not just of hundreds, but of thousands of millions of people across the world, has lifted them out of grinding poverty, of grinding drudgery. They're saying 50%, for the first time in world history, 50% of the world's population is middle class. So we've got to remember that. We're talking here about first world problems because there's great enthusiasm for capitalism in the rest of the world. So we've got to remember that. Now, when I was reading the book, I was very strongly reminded, this is another excellent book, John Bew, he's at King's College London, wrote an excellent biography recently of Clement Attlee, of course, who was Labour leader for many years and Prime Minister, I'm not sure I dare mention this year, 1945. Now, he was obviously a Labour man. He was very radical in some respects, but he was a very brave soldier in the First World War. He was the last man off the beaches at Gallipoli. He was a patriot. He was a supporter of the monarchy. He was a supporter of America. And he, and Paul will like this, placed great emphasis on individual responsibilities even more than rights. I mean, what a contrast with a piece of social rubbish like Jeremy Corbyn. But that's another, maybe you can deal with this, John. Now, but how do we restore this world? And Paul's got a number of remedies, but I think he really he mentions these in the books, but he's skirting around it. So he raises two major challenges in political economy. Now, economists believe strongly in the gains from trade, to have free trade areas. And the theory of this goes back 200 years to a great English economist, David Ricardo. Now, he made an assumption in his theory, which was perfectly reasonable to make at the time, that capital was immobile. And that's now completely gone. The last 30 or 40 years has seen the complete free movement of capital. And Paul skirts around this, like I say, in a number of ways in his book. But if we're actually going to restore any sort of world that Paul would like to recognize again, we need to take some rather dramatic action in reining in finance capital. See, while I was an undergraduate, I was a social democrat. We used to debate with the Truss from the public schools, but never in their wildest dreams would finance capital have conquered the world like it has now. It completely dominates the world. And this is a really major political challenge. I believe we have to restore capital controls. We have to have high levels of reserve asset ratios to guarantee the security of the financial system. And that governments need to eliminate deficits on average over the cycle to stop endless debt creation. But my final point, the second one, and this runs throughout the book, and I identify the main enemy which Paul has got in his book. And this is the enemy within metropolitan liberalism. This is the main enemy that Paul comes out in chapter after chapter of his book. Now, Bob Rothal, who used to be head of economics at Cambridge, and we attacked this in a series of articles 15, 20 years ago when David was editor of Prospect. We were out on a limb then. It's more popular these days. But the essential task of political economy at the present time is to destroy the hegemony of discussion that this pernicious and self-indulgent ideology the grip that it holds. Paul attacks it ferociously in the book, and I agree with every word that he writes. It's self-regard, it's moral superiority, it's disdain for people who are not as, quotes, clever as they are. And that's a key theme. He's got an excellent chapter on the family, and family relationships build trust. They encourage long-term investment. They encourage all the cooperative values, but they've been torn down by the ludicrous assertion, which is held amongst the Lady Hale of Richmond, where I live now, that all family structures are of equal value. Now, we have to destroy this, both politically and intellectually. That's the central challenge of political economy. But how is this to be done? This is where I final point I disagree with Paul. That it seems to me that populists such as Trump and Salvini are not mutineers. They are the ones who are actually attacking liberalism effectively in a very, very positive way. They're actually replacing it. And we see the squeals of outrage when they lose Brexit. We see the squeals of outrage when they can't prevent the nomination of a judge in the United States. And it's this that Paul doesn't like these people, but it seems to me there's no point in trying to deal with liberalism, with metropolitanism, by facts and rational analysis, because they don't believe in it. Paul's trying to deal with them rational analysis. They have to be dealt with on the sphere of politics and political economy. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we're getting quite a range of views here tonight. John, do you want to?
Yeah, I will. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's always good to be at Policy Exchange. slightly warmer climate than often experienced in the Parliamentary Labour Party, so thanks for the invitation. I'm a massive fan of Paul's book, actually. I come from a slightly different angle, either from Liz, in that I read it, and from David Paul. But I want to say, actually, it was something you said about Michael Sandel endorsing the book. I was in a seminar with Michael Sandel recently, and he was brutal about the failures of the social democratic traditions. It's lost its ethical or moral potency, and it's become technocratic, remote, captured by cosmopolitan thinking, etc. And he said the real kicker is that nowhere is this acknowledged within the centre-left, the scale of the crisis itself. And I see this as a sort of antidote to that challenge, which is epic in proportions, actually. And I see this, Sandel's argument was, where is the renewed public philosophy of social democracy? And that's where I would locate this book, actually, as a building block within that. So I do not think it is insignificant, nor do I think it's a pragmatic exercise in policy making, which you sort of slightly sell yourself. I think it's a very complicated, philosophically rich, textured work, which is trying to intervene, actually, to resurrect a tradition of political philosophy which is virtue-based rather than utility-based or rights-based. You know, it tries to excavate a lost tradition, an exiled tradition within modern political thinking, and that is a great service to the political conversation, the philosophical conversation, and the economic conversation, because it taps into moral economic arguments of the 20th century which are lost, which need to be heated up and reintroduced into the public conversation to save it. Because where I sit, my sense is this is a very agile book across philosophy, economics, politics, as well as talking to the left and right, partly because it speaks to what I would say is almost the collapse in real time of the dominant political traditions of the last 200 years. Well, by that I mean liberalism, conservatism, and socialism as encased within the liberal parties, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, whereby in conservatism, you know, property-based ownership seems to be collapsing. They have no sort of inclusive growth models. The notion of sound money seems to offer diminishing returns. So they're sort of retreating into a nativism. And I thought Liz didn't quite confront some of those tensions within the modern conservative tradition. Similarly, I would be brutal around the Labour Party and social democracy. That's lost its ethical quality. The post-war richness of social democracy was because it offered a moral challenge to capital, to regulate, to build the welfare state, to civilise capitalism. That lost that as it retreated into the third way. It got beaten down by Thatcher, Reagan, etc., etc. The third way was try to moderate without challenging those fundamentals of that revolution. And social democracy is in free fall because it doesn't even acknowledge the scale of the challenge that is needed. And similarly, liberal democracy with the Orange Book victories and the coalition fallout offers little as well. So if you're happy with that, fine. You know, if you're not, that's why I like the anger and the energy in the book, because it's trying to rebuild a public philosophy for the centre-left based on a sense of not on utility nor on rights, but a question of virtue, our duties and obligations, about a humanity that transcends our physiological characteristics, that seeks to rebuild a sense of common endeavour, the sense of a common good. These words have lost their real meaning in terms of the public conversation, and to try and reintroduce that to sort of alter the public conversation should be warmly appreciated as a generous public act by an eminent intellectual. So I really welcome the book. I think it's a fantastic contribution. We need more of them, not less of them. And I think rather than running just to the policy, I think we should acknowledge the richness and the depth of what is being attempted here and try and organise on it, and not in a tribal sense of the left, because I find it tragedy. It's a tragedy being played out in real time what's happening in conservatism, as well as the centre-left social democratic tradition and liberalism, actually, in terms of liberalism being collapsed into forms of liberalism which would be unrecognisable in the 20th century. So cumulatively, I think this is a fantastic contribution to a public conversation that is needed, because as conservatism, liberalism and social democracy have vacated their space, authoritarian populism, techno-utopianism, you know, the centrism of Macron or Trudeau have inhabited it at the cost of a richer story of what countries and the world could be. So, thanks for inviting. It's a great
last but not least, my colleague Warwick perhaps will attempt a modest defence of Liz Truss.
Well, first of all, I'm joining with everyone saying it's a very rich book. It's a very interesting book. It's a pleasure to read. And in places, it's a very moving book, actually. It's a very personal testimony to Paul's life. It certainly evinced in me a very, very deep anxiety. I read the book on a train going to where I live. I live in Plymouth, and the train was slightly delayed, and I got in very, very late. And I woke up the next morning, I was in the flat on my own. There was nobody around, and I had this deep sense of anxiety. And it's the part of the book dealing with super powerful, super clever, super dynamic parents who supervise the education of their children. And that brought forth all sorts of deep buried Prousting memories. And it was the thought of your wife supervising my Latin homework. All those unseen translations. I can't tell you the state of anxiety I was that Saturday morning when I woke up. But it's a very interesting book. It's ambitious. And if I may say something, it fails its ambition. And the starting point of the failure of that ambition is to actually couch it within the framework of Anthony Crossland himself. And I think it's because the conservative enemy and the future of socialism in itself, right at the start, was never going to actually work within a modern market economy. And the person who was the most effective critic of Tony Crossland was a man called Nicholas Davenport. He was a friend of Keynes, a financier, an investor, and long-term columnist on The Spectator and The New Statesman. And he wrote a book called The Split Society, published in 1964. In fact, I've got the presentation copy he gave to Harold Wilson on my desk next door. And what he said is that Crossland had this idea that companies were not interested in profits, and that they would invest for good relations, for public relations, and so on, and that would be effectively the high road to undermining a market economy. And of course, the Labour government took office in 1964 with many ideas of intervention, some of which I think, in some respects, you're interested in exploring again. And it is interesting to look at what happened to the rate of return on UK capital and profits in the 10 years that followed. And even before the great oil crisis of 1973-75, even by 1970, rates of return on private capital had fallen very sharply. And of course, Andrew Glynn and his collaborator, I think it was Bob Sutcliffe, wrote that book, The Crisis of British Capitalism, because of the crisis of profits. I think it was slightly unfair on Liz Truss all on her own and Mrs. Thatcher destroying Sheffield. I think there were complex other things in play, not least the complex impact of North Sea oil. And the role inevitably on the exchange rate, and as John Kay put it very well at the time, I remember talking to him about it, he said, well, you've got to understand that market incentives in the UK economy are very severely blunted. And inevitably, that change in the real goods sector, with that discovering that resource, was going to provoke a change in the economy, and it was going to take a very substantial change in relative prices provoked through the exchange rate to bring that about. And I think you'll find that that was one of the huge factors in concentrating the process of deindustrialization in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And I think it's worth remembering, the first book I read about deindustrialization was produced by Neddy in 1978. So these things all predated Mrs. Thatcher. And there was a crisis of the social democratic state in the 1970s. Now, I wrote a piece which was a comment on Chris Bickerton's paper. And what I said in that was that nobody in 1970 wanted to really move away from the post-war consensus. Yet both parties in different ways found themselves having to do it at great pain. So, for example, you think of Harold Wilson and Barbara Castle doing their In Place of Strife, looking at trade unions. The huge effort was made to try and keep the show on the road, but it fell apart. And of course, the year before Tony Crossland died, he made that memorable speech, "The party and local government expenditure is over." And that brings me on to my concern about the regions. Now, I have a very different take about the English and Welsh and Scottish and Northern Irish regions than you have. My impression is that we've been very good at closing things down that had to be closed down because realistically it wasn't possible to maintain it given where we were. But we found it extremely difficult to see natural evolution of markets rebuilding in their stead. And I think an insight that you can get into this comes from Germany. There's a bloke called Dennis Snow who runs the Kiel Institute. If you met him, you would think he's English. Actually, he's Austrian. And he's written this suite of papers. You couldn't publish it in the United Kingdom because the name would be wrong. It's called The Caring Hand That Cripples. And it examines the unification in 1990 the role of the exchange rate, 1 for 1. When East German productivity was running at around 2/5 of the West, you raise the prices of labour in the public sector to equal that in the West. You actually bring up prices in the contested sector, not quite to the full West German level. You have transfer payments at the same level as the West, and you have a permanent stasis where East German incomes grow very rapidly through transfer payments in the public sector between 1990 and about 1997, and thereafter it's very slow indeed. And what I think has happened, because we have national collective bargaining in the public sector and national transfer payments, that you actually see market clearing levels in labour markets across the UK, outside the southeast, in a very different way than they would be in place of a public service which was able to respond more flexibly to its local labour markets. And I think that plays a very significant part within it. There's an interesting part of your book which is about taxing economic rents. Now, I think, if I may say so, you're genuinely onto something. You may be familiar with the bloke who used to run the fiscal division of the IMF, Vito Tanzin. I mean, he's very interested in these complex rents that are being generated. And like me, I think you went to university to read law and decided to do something more useful. And you actually, rather like me, secretly have it in for the lawyers in a way. But there are all sorts of rents that are there. I'm not certain I would advise a British government to go after those rents in London in an aggressive way, because the modern financial markets in London play such a critical part of London's economic activity, came here by accident in the early 1960s because of the withholding tax imposed by the Kennedy administration in the early 1960s. And we have been on the back of that and enjoyed the benefit of that for some 50 years. It wasn't automatic that those markets were going to come here. For example, when Warwick did the first Eurobond, it was actually done in Luxembourg. Merrill Lynch, my former employer, wanted to concentrate their Eurobond trading in Switzerland, and they started to do it. Why do you think they backed away from Switzerland? Because there was a withholding tax and a financial transaction tax that meant they withdrew. Also, I don't say this to provoke David, but it was quite difficult to get some of the immigration visas to get the Americans to go and work there. So I think one's got to be very careful that at some point London is trading on an agglomeration that runs the risk of being repatriated to New York and to Chicago and potentially to other places like Hong Kong and Singapore. The other thing I would say, with the resources you could get from London, do not necessarily assume that you will be able to stimulate genuine economic activity in the regions, because there is a very powerful crowding out effect from the public sector, and I think that what you see is often the region that pays suffers, and the region that gets the resources suffers as well. And as an economist at the ECB put it very well about 8 years ago, you get a convergence of immiserization. So I think it's a very, very difficult trick to pull off. And on that note, I'm happy to end.
Good. Thank you. Well, that's three excellent responses. I mean, I just want to, Paul, do you want to just briefly respond to what has been said, and then I'll open it up to people can make comments.
So I have to disagree with the idea that the extremes have the solution to liberalism. I think the extreme right, the extreme left have we know their agendas. They're not really there to fix the practical anxieties of ordinary people, but they're talking the language of those anxieties because there's a vacuum. The mainstream liberal centre is not talking those concerns. And so those concerns are being used by the extremes. I don't trust either of the extremes an inch. They will use those, if they come to power, they will use it for their own agendas. Let me just, with John, just one point about pragmatism. Everything you said, I really agreed. And in my talk, I'd underplayed the centrality of ethics to the future of capitalism. After all, the first 4 chapters are all about ethics. And it's a plea to try and restore ethical purpose in our society at the level of the firm, at the level of the family, at the level of the state. But the pragmatic tradition that I'm drawing on is a tradition which is indeed deeply ethical. These were moral philosophers who came up with the pragmatic tradition. But what they said was they juxtaposed pragmatism against ideology. The ideologues believe in some permanent utopia, which they have the handbook. This is how to attain this utopia, and it's permanent. And that idea that there is a permanent utopia and a single guidebook that will get you there is crazy. And the alternative to that is that you recognize we're in a dynamic system which keeps inventing new forms of problems, and you've got to understand context in order to come up with solutions. And that's what is the philosophical tradition of pragmatism, but it's certainly not unethical. I'm awfully sorry that you attacked me for ignoring Dennis Snower. That was really unlucky, because tomorrow morning at the National Institute, Dennis Snower and I launch the hub on macro-social interactions for the Economic and Social Research Council, which we co-direct. And the first topic we touch is British productivity. So come with us to the National Institute and see us being so completely unjoined up, right? I mean, I was Skyping with him this morning just before he flew in. So I'm fully on board with Dennis Snower. And your point about the agglomeration of finance in London, I quite explicitly say we should tax it, but we should not kill the goose. We should pick the eggs up, right? And there's less eggs than there was because of all sorts of mess-ups, right? But there are still eggs there. And your touching faith in the market to rekindle agglomerations in broken cities. I'm not trying to revive the steel industry in Sheffield. I'm trying to get new knowledge clusters, and these are huge coordination problems which you need active public policy to deal with. And the allergy of the far right to any sort of active public policy, I mean, the right wants nation without state. The left wants state without nation. The libertarian loonies in West Coast want neither state nor nation, right? And what we need is both.
Yeah. Anyway, let's just throw it open. I mean, I might just get in with a quick question, observation of my own. I mean, I think I reviewed your book very favourably in the Evening Standard, as you know. I think it's a great sort of manifesto of the kind of radical centre, or sort of social democratic centre, really. Indeed, I think it's the book that most closely embodies the great Daniel Bell political credo, who was asked in the 70s or 80s what his politics were, and he said, I'm editing slightly, he said, I'm a market-friendly social democrat in economics, I'm a liberal in politics, and I'm somewhat conservative in social and cultural matters. And for all sorts of historic reasons, no political party really in Europe over the recent decades has represented that combination. But the one question or observation I wanted to put to you was that you're rightly nostalgic, I think, for the sort of social democratic communitarianism of the kind of 45 to 70 period, notwithstanding some of the problems of that time. But you explicitly say that grew out of the enormous kind of national effort of the Second World War, and the kind of the creation of a very powerful sort of communitarian spirit in the country, which is evidently no longer there. I mean, not only are we divided down the middle on so many of these big issues like Brexit, but we're also much more fragmented and sort of dispersed, but politically, as you say, educationally, geographically. So how do we recreate some of the things? How do we create some of the things that you're proposing in the absence of that spirit? Well, but answer that in a minute. Let's throw it open.
Yeah.
So who else wants to? John at the front here. We've got a microphone, I think.
Yes, I think
you are. I mean, most people will know, but just say who you are.
I'm John Mills. it's not surprising we've got a problem. If you look at the growth rate in the British economy over the last 10 years, it's 1.1%, barely enough to keep up with the population growth. Hardly surprisingly, therefore, more than half the population got no increase in real incomes. But the really daunting thing is that I think if you look ahead for the next 10 years, we're likely to see the same thing happening again, with all the consequences this is going to produce in terms of social and political and economic distress. And my question to you is, do you think that what your remedies that you laid out are going to do anything sufficient to deal with that problem? Because I don't believe that you can solve the problem of getting real wages up unless you can get the growth rate up to somewhere around about 3.5%. If it goes on at 1.5%, there'll be no increase for most people, and all the dystopia that you described is going to continue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it Trevor at the back? John Lewis got a favourable mention earlier.
Thank you very much. I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book. I look forward to it. But two small things puzzled me about what you said. First of all, Switzerland, which you picked out, puzzling reference, because if it works that well, how is it that Switzerland now has, I think, a quarter of its population who are foreign-born immigrants? Why is that necessary, and runs against, I think, what you've been saying for the last couple of years? I remember your essay in the London Review of Books, I think it was, in which you said that we've got to essentially hold back on immigration. Well, if Switzerland is a model in anything, surely it can't be a model in that. I think Switzerland, with Australia, has the highest level of immigration anywhere in the Western world. And the other question which came up, as David said, he mentioned John Lewis, and I had the privilege of being president of John Lewis for the last 4 years, and I now run chairman of another business. One of the things that I think is striking here is that nobody has yet mentioned what I think is a central fact of most businesses' lives right now, and it is not Brexit, it's not any of these questions, it is technology. That is 10 times as transformational as anything that's been mentioned tonight. And if I walk into one of our warehouses, that's what everybody from top to bottom is interested in, because it's both transforming the prospects for jobs, it is also transforming the culture, and of course we also know that it is transforming the way in which value and wealth are created. And I'm quite struck that we haven't had anything to say about that this evening, and social democracy doesn't appear to have anything to say about it. I'd be very interested to know what your thoughts are about the potential impact, or not the potential, the certain impact of the fourth industrial revolution, which is pretty much on us right now.
Thanks. Any more gentlemen right here at the front? And then we'll go back to our distinguished panel, unless anyone else wants to chip in.
Gintas Vilkelis. I've actually been studying the root causes of poverty in this country for the last few years. And one realization I came to, that the reason for this London-centric agglomeration is a direct byproduct of the current hyper-centralized fiscal system. And the reason is actually it's a natural dynamics that happens every time. You have an area where the laws, regulations, taxes are almost identical, and there is a complete freedom of movement within it. And it works basically like this. As a business owner, you want to base yourself within the largest concentration and vicinity of suppliers and employees and customers. And as a potential employer, which is pretty much everybody else, you want to base yourself within the largest vicinity of good jobs, i.e. employers. So London is that in here. And the only way to resolve this, the only sustainable and systemic way to resolve this, is to break up the country into areas where each of them has the powers and the permission to make themselves attractive in some unique way to the businesses to come in that create jobs and make the economy self-sufficient in each one of them. And each one of those chunks should be about the size of the kind of commutable distance. If you make it much bigger than that, then the thing kind of you get just a smaller centralized state. So as long as this is not done, you can put the most talented, the most motivated people in power. They will fail to deliver a meaningful improvement, and it will not be their fault. It just they are setting themselves for failure because the task is impossible under the current system.
Well, thank you. Interesting theory. Perhaps could be the theme of another book. Good. Well, let's go back. Let me just give everybody 2 sentences, apart from Paul, who can wind up. Do you mind?
Well, I think
other Paul. Yeah.
My fundamental question to Paul remains that almost every other page of his book is an attack on the ideology of metropolitan liberalism. He pinpoints this as an absolutely central problem in political economy. It runs throughout the book, and yet he has no answer how to deal with this pernicious ideology. Facts and rational analysis will not eliminate it because they don't care about them. So, how from your comfortable centrist position will you deal with this?
John?
I'll give Paul an opportunity to respond.
Well, he's going to bring
Right,
up,
okay,
he's going to sum up.
I'll take up I did mention sort of technological utopianism filling some of the vacuums as the different traditions seem to be emptying out of liberalism, conservatism and social democracy. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about that. I mean, but the John Lewis element is quite interesting because I would say one bit that when you talk about vocation, etc., Paul, one thing where I do think the Labour Party, in its present iteration, whatever you think about it, is getting the jump on modern politics is around reorganisation of the firm and going into some of those ethical questions around stakeholding and fundamental architectural questions. And John MacDonald announced, it got a bit of coverage, there's an very old idea from classical social democracy from Sweden, actually. The researchers in LO devised systems of worker ownership funds in the 70s. It never really caught on, but John MacDonald's literally picked up on this today at the Labour Party conference and started talking about forms of stakeholder ownership, which I think is a rich theme in terms of developing some of these points, which does get into some of the fundamental questions of inclusive growth, new forms of sort of redesigning the system, does tap into some of the technological questions, and forms of sort of exit voice, the role of how you regulate the labour market to ensure that this flatlining of this wage crash of a decade or longer can be confronted through forms of dividends or whatever. So some of these things are in play, it seems to me, and should be more generously acknowledged than the present language around the left and right sort of crowd out at present.
Warwick, final word from you, and then Paul.
I think that the big difficulty with Paul's ambition to regenerate economic activity across the regions of devolved parts of the United Kingdom is extremely difficult to actually do it. It's been very difficult in every country that's tried to do it. We've tried everything in the UK from the Special Areas Acts on in the 1930s. There are these genuine crowding out effects. I think it's quite interesting. Paul jibbed at my comparison of that part of work that Dennis did, but it's quite interesting. Alison Wolfe and Andrew Glynn, before his death, looked at the northeast of England, and he said, well, whatever this is, it's not a working labour market that is actually clearing in a normal way. And I very much hope that Paul, in his remarks, will pursue the actual details of the point I'm making, rather than concentrating on his... I'm sure we'll have a great time with Dennis tomorrow, but in terms of how do you actually deal with those transfer payments and wages in places like my hometown, where the public service is a form of sheltered employment that really does crowd out private sector employment. And the other thing I'd just say in the context of that very interesting question you ask about the fiscal state, I think there's a lot in that. But I just cannot see how you can move to it because so much of the UK economic base is lopsided. There's so many concentrated retirement communities where you can have every taxpayer going, but you don't have an economic base to tax. And Cornwall is next door to Plymouth, so I'm well acquainted with what is essentially a largely retirement community.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to...
Yeah, so just to pick up on it, of course I can address your point about the how do you revive broken cities, and is it a problem caused by wages not dropping enough in broken cities, which is what you're implying. And you're just wrong, I'm sorry. And the person I invoke here is not Dennis, it's Tony Venables, who's one of the top 3 economic geographers on earth. And Tony has got recent work showing that market forces work to actually deepen the problem of broken cities, because what happens in a broken city, wages fall, rents fall, and rubbish jobs then come in. The sort of stuff, the firms that depend upon very low costs, those firms are not knowledge intensive, and it traps the city in a load of non-tradable activities like warehousing and that sort of stuff. And then the city's just, the market has moved it into a cul-de-sac. It's no longer on the skill accumulation ladder. Now you can avoid that, but you need active public policy that brings in anchor firms, knowledge-intensive firms, works around clusters of typically with a university. So there's things you can do. It's not easy. I entirely agree with your point that what you need is, as it were, an agglomeration in each of the major regions. And yes, you need decentralization to enable that. But the limits to decentralization is you don't want the big agglomeration, London, to keep all its gains. So you need a fiscal transfer between agglomerations, between successful and broken agglomerations, but then you need enough autonomy in the broken agglomerations that they can recover. Let me turn to John's point about redesigning the firm. And I work very closely with Colin Mayer, who is the professor of finance at Oxford. He was the dean of the business school. And so he knows a lot about business. And we are doing a joint lecture tour. He's got a book coming out, and he's got a British Academy program about repurposing the firm. And his whole point is you've got to get back to an age before the only function of a firm was make profits. And so, Colin Mayer knows more about firms than, he's a world-class authority on this. And he's very consistent with this. You've got to rejig the boards, you've got to rejig ownership, you've got to move these firms so that they actually have a sense of purpose larger than making profit. In the book, the example I give is Imperial Chemical Industries, which when we were kids, that was the highest esteemed firm in the whole country, right? And its mission was, we're going to be the best chemical firm on earth. And then in the 1990s, its mission statement changed to, we aim to maximize shareholder value. Whoever got up in the morning saying, today I'm going to maximize shareholder value. I talked with a retired senior executive in ICI. He said that stuff, that rubbish broke the firm because it demotivated senior management. We had to attend all these rubbish seminars on shareholder value, and it just destroyed a sense of purpose in the firm. So there's a lot of activity here. Other countries, I hadn't realized until I did this book, Britain is at an extreme end of short-termism and profit maximization. America, France, Germany, they all have better defenses than we have against this short-termism of pressure to, the Germans have family companies, they have banks that coordinate shareholdings and so on.
Does America have?
It has family companies. When Kraft decided it wanted to move into chocolate, Kraft was an American company, the obvious chocolate company was Hershey. They didn't go for Hershey because it was a family blocking holding. What did they go for? Cadbury. Right? They made all sorts of promises about their ethical responsibilities to Cadbury. Ha ha. Right?
Trevor's point about Switzerland.
I mean, come on. What I was talking about at Switzerland was they get vocational training right. I'm not saying they get everything right. They're a pretty unequal country, right? But they certainly get vocational training right, right? And you linked your point about we need lots of immigration with the point that we've got technological change coming down which will destroy jobs. I mean, try and connect those 2 points, eh? No, I was saying try and connect the 2 points. Thank you. Right. I guess I'm done.
Anyway, well, thank you very much. That was, it really is a very, very good book, and I want to see those piles at the back substantially reduced in the next 5 or 10 minutes. But could we, and do stay for a glass of wine if you'd like, but anyway, thank you so much to Sir Paul and to the 3 discussants. So can we say thank you?